activities and so forth later on, what you can do is email me directly, okay, and let me know if there's any issue with recording. Right. Thank you very much for responding to the poll, all those of you that can. Hopefully you all hear me okay. So it is now 11 o'clock. We shall begin. So what I'm going to quickly do is just give a little introduction to myself. And what I hope to do throughout today's session is to actually, I suppose, to give you and provide for you means and modes, if you like, in terms of how you might run your own session, whether it's online or face-to-face. And what I simply mean by that is that some of the things I will do with you, because we'll do a couple of activities, and the way that I'm going to teach this morning, hopefully will give you ideas and structure for your own session. So as you see there, there's the two links, the tutor pack and the actual slides that we have here today. And there's a couple more links at the end of the slides in terms of my open folder and so forth, where you will find additional materials. So a little potted history, and I suppose of myself, and the reason being is to actually open up communication, to actually give you a little kind of moment of personal kind of contact. And this is important in terms of establishing rapport with your learners. So obviously you don't need to give them your entire history, you can give them something kind of meaningful. So in terms of meaningful for you, in respect of me, I started in UCD in the 90s as a research assistant in archaeology. And from there I moved into the department, working on various projects and working on a practical masters and publications and the like. From there I moved out of archaeology and into a unit that is no longer in UCD, which is basically doing a similar fashion in terms of providing supports, pedagogical supports and technological supports across the university. And from there I moved into teaching and learning in, gosh, I think in 2004 or so. And I've been there ever since. So I have a bit of a history with technology. So you kind of come to the right place for this morning's session in terms of being online. Okay, so what I'm going to do with you this morning is basically set out a series of kind of activities and I suppose question prompts for you, because what I really want you to be able to do when you leave this session is not only be in a position to go forward and give a tutorial and prepare a tutorial, but to actually think about your role, to think about how you can adapt and develop that going on. So it's all well and good to actually kind of, you know, go in and do your kind of hour or 2 hours, but what we really want to be able to do is think, gosh, what's the next thing I can do? How can I support my learners? Where is the, or what might be the kind of alternative solution or an innovative solution to apply to that particular thing that arose in my tutorial? And by that I mean issues, dilemmas, questions. And I suppose the thing that you most certainly need to be able to do is to be open to change, to adapting your approach as you go. However, in terms of the in terms of the specifics for this morning, what we're going to focus on by means of outcomes are what you see here on the slide. And I suppose any session that you and I do, we want to be able to tell our learners that by the end of this session, this is what you will be able to do. And consequently, this is how we are going to do it together. So having learning outcomes or session objectives or session aim, whatever your terminology, is really important, because what it will enable you and I to do is not only be clear and precise in what's going to happen within the session, but more importantly, to measure and validate, did that actually happen? So at the end of the session, what I want you guys to be able to do is have a look at communication techniques, realize what an effective session might be and how to design that, begin to reflect on your role as a tutor, and obviously create some kind of tutorial plan that will be of benefit to you. So I have activities and I have questions and I have materials that will hopefully enable these things to happen. So by the end of this session, I will have not a complete appreciation or understanding, but I will have some kind of indication of how well you have been able to take some of these outcomes on board. And that's important for any session. So it means that when the session is over, I can say to myself, well, actually, they began to prepare the tutorial plan and they started to reflect. So how can I follow up with that in the next session? Or what additional information might I be able to provide them to get them to complete that outcome? So outcomes, objectives, aims, whatever terminology you want to do are essential at the beginning of your session. So that final little line there, is there anything else? This is immediately establishing a dialogue with you guys. And I genuinely mean that. If you have something else you want, put it on the text, put it on an email to me afterwards. But in session, you're quite free to ask me a question. And we will actually have a couple of kind of breakouts and kind of Q&A sessions throughout this session this morning. So you feel free to ask a question if anything arises. But the very fact that I asked that question of you is kind of nice, but also important, because it means that you are thinking immediately, oh, this is what Dave is going to do in terms of those key 4 outcomes. Is there anything specific that I might like to do? Is there anything specific that I need to do? So what you're unintentionally doing by asking that question, or me asking that question, what you are unintentionally doing as a learner, is you're beginning to identify your learning gaps. You're beginning to identify what it is you really want to get from this session. So that dialogue with oneself is really important. Whether or not you actually ask me a question of it is perhaps moot, but it's important to ask the question because it gets you thinking. Okay? Okay, I have a little advert before we get into the session in its entirety. And this is basically to tell you that we have a module. So if you are a graduate student, which I'm sure many of you are, there is actually a module that we run, which in essence basically is this induction session expanded and goes into a variety of kind of things that we will look at today in much more detail, in much more depth. And obviously you can get credits for this. So it's a 5-credit module, 5 ECTS. It will run next trimester. So it'll start in January, February. So if you are interested, drop me a line or contact your local college office or whatever, and you can follow up with that. Okay, advert over. So quick overview of what exactly we are going to do. And you probably say to yourself, oh, David's just said that. I did, but those were outcomes. This is an overview. And again, this is, I suppose, for clarity of purpose, for kind of establishing exactly what it is we're going to do. And this is important in respect of that. So we are going to have a little bit of focus on communication skills. And perhaps that's never more important than now, because we may find ourselves in an online environment, and making certain that we are able to communicate effectively is going to be really important. When we're in a room, we can read the situation, we can see, we can hear, we can even sense the, how our learners are engaging with us. In an online environment, that's going to be somewhat difficult. So you and I need to make certain that we have good communication skills. We know what those are, and we can actually kind of maintain them. The effective practice one is really almost like a question to yourself. What does that look like? And how can I establish, but also how can I maintain? And in reality, that's a trick question, because it's something that is ongoing. Even all the time, I will take note of what I'm doing and things that have worked and say, this could be better, this could be changed. I'm going to try something new and see how that goes. New discipline-specific needs are arising, both from a professional stance and both from maybe kind of graduate attributes, necessary kind of skills need to be interrelated into our program. So all of these things are going to change and cause change for us. So effective practice is an ongoing endeavor. The design of small groups obviously is exactly what we're going to kind of focus on in terms of what that looks like. But the key thing to remember here is that if you design a session well, then it can equally be expanded or scaled up in terms of teaching. So it is not necessary to think that a small session is a kind of a pedagogical, paradigm in and of itself. The design skills, the teaching and learning skills therein will be equally applicable elsewhere. And I suppose the other thing to realize is that my small group might be different to your small group. So if I have a class of 500, then perhaps my small groups are actually 50. If you have a class of 100, then perhaps your small groups are 10. We each have different kind of levels of what we think is a small group and how we might address that. So consequently, the design doesn't matter in terms of its scale, it matters how you do it in the first instance. Issues and dilemmas, we all have those. And I suppose what I want to be able to do is for you to air some of those. And I suppose this is kind of important because, like in many instances, it's it's the kind of the hidden fears that one has in terms of how am I going to do this? What happens if they don't speak? What happens if I don't see anybody? What happens if they don't turn up? What happens if I'm lost and I've got the wrong information or I can't answer that question? All of these things bubble around in our head. And addressing those kinds of fears and being certain in terms of how you will deal with them are really important. What I have at the end of these slides, and I'm going to say this now because who knows how long we will have to get through all of this, is a series of slides that I kind of deal with practicalities. And if I don't get to them in their totality, I will get to them. If I don't get to them in their totality, treat them as a series of question prompts for yourself, okay? And by that, I mean, look at them and say, have I addressed this? Can I address this? What will this do for me? It's really kind of a rounding up of the session. But sometimes, depending on how you and I go in the beginning, we might kind of squeeze, hop, and jump over some of the elements herein. And actually, now that I say that, the workbook that you have is obviously quite comprehensive. So the Tutor Induction workbook has lots and lots of things in there. The idea of that is that it's a resource for you. It's a resource for you not only for today, but going forward throughout this trimester and throughout the academic year. There are lots of things in there that perhaps you don't need, perhaps you might not need, but it's good to have. And what I'm actually also doing, and I say this now, is that I'm developing an Explore module, which is basically a module that sits on Brightspace that is open, kind of open educational resource. And basically, I'll expand some of those pieces within the Tutor Induction into activities and newer resources in respect of the Explore module. So that will come live. Well, actually, it is live, but there's nothing in it at the moment. That's just by the by. Okay, what I'm going to do now is actually to break out into groups. Now, the key reason why I'm getting to do this is because I want you to have a moment to yourselves to have a little chat. You know what it is that we're going to do today in the next couple of hours or the next hour and a half or whatever it may be. And I want you to have a chat with one another. And the reason why I want you to do that, for my purpose, is actually to get you guys together, get you guys thinking, get you guys seeing one another, experiencing, sharing a couple of ideas and thoughts, okay? So in terms of the icebreaker itself, what I want you to consider, in the workbook, there are a couple of things. In the workbook, there is a welcome card, just by way of an example. And it just says, who you are, what you do, your research topic, your favorite piece to teach. And it also has a left of field item. And by that, I mean it has a little quirky item. So the quirky item could be anything from what's your favorite football team to your movie star. And what I have on the list at the moment is, and I change this all the time, is just to try and capture something from your bucket list. So if you don't know what a bucket list is, it's simply something to do before you pass off this mortal coil, something exciting, whether that's climb Mount Everest, whether it's to read Tolstoy, whether it's to do a marathon, whatever it may be, okay, something on your bucket list. And the quirky thing is there on purpose, because the idea of that in an icebreaker term of sense is that it's to allow everyone to engage. So you might not engage on the core discipline topic. You might not engage on your research endeavor. You might not engage on your school piece, but you can always have a chat in terms of an icebreaker. You can always have a chat about something superfluous, okay? Something left of field. And that's the reason that's there. However, when you go into your breakout groups, which I'm going to start setting up right now as I speak, what I also want you to do is think about, so two things what I want you to do in the breakout group. First is chat about your bucket list items. What is it that you'd like to do? And say hello to one another. Second is think about exactly what is the purpose of a breakout group, okay? And how might you use them? So just have your chat about bucket list and breakouts, icebreakers in their sense, okay? Icebreakers, what are icebreakers for? And that's a loaded question because you know, obviously, that there's something in it more than just kind of at a start of a session, okay? Now, before you go into the breakout group, there's a couple of questions I'm just going to answer. The tutor handbook, I will send that onto the chat momentarily. I'll put a link onto it. Oh, someone has done it already. Thank you very much, Connor. Excellent. I love it when you all work together. And there was another question there in relation to managing students' expectations. Yes, we will definitely come to that within our session today. Okay, Keith? So, right, what I'm going to do is get you into your breakout groups. I'm going to start that now. I'll give you a heads up as to when that actually ends. So two things to do: chat about bucket list items, just as a means of introducing one another, and the core content, i.e. the pedagogical content, is what is an icebreaker for? How can you use it? All right. So we'll say you have a couple of minutes to do this, but I will give you a heads Hi guys, are you in the main room still? You just arrived? Irene, Megan, Stephen?
Yes, sorry, we arrived late. Apologies.
Okay, that's okay. So they're in breakouts. Sorry, I was just kind of in and out of different breakout groups. So you can see the piece of the slide there still, hopefully. So basically, you and I can chat here. So basically, before we call back the others in a minute or two. So you're basically to think about the purpose of a breakout group, or an icebreaker rather, and how and why you might use it. And then the example that I have in the workbook, there is a little left of field box question to you guys. And the reason for a left of field one is hopefully I say, that is what you can all chat to. So in this instance, it's kind of on what's on your bucket list, things that you'd like to do that you wouldn't ordinarily do. So the idea was to have a group and then to think about how might you use icebreakers? What is their purpose? When might they be used and how might they be used? So if you want to just kind of chat amongst yourselves here in the main room, please do, rather than me trying to kind of fit you into other groups at this point, because we're going to close those up. Yeah? Or even use the text tool. You can do that as well if you want to use the chat tool.
Okay, who else is in this room active?
I can see a few people.
Because they're not, yeah.
Can you speak, guys? Or text? No? You can chat to me, Irene.
Okay, cool. So my school is the agriculture and food science. I'm a technical officer. I'm researching sustainable agriculture, and I love to teach technical chemical analysis or other type of analysis or technical stuff. My bucket list is to go living in another country at a certain point.
Okay. Excellent. That sounds nice. And what do you think you could use icebreakers for?
To get people more relaxed, easier to share because they feel like they can speak, especially for the shyer people.
Sure, absolutely. And then when might you use it?
At the beginning, usually.
At the beginning, usually. You say usually. Is there any other time when you unusually might use it?
No, well, when there are tea breaks or breaks, any type of breaks. So when it's moment to relax a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. When I think you're absolutely right. I think it can be used as a kind of a way of refreshing and energizing people in that respect. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to call time on the breakout groups. So let us do that. So sit tight there, Irene, and we'll get them all back.
Yeah. So I was listening to you.
Rudely interrupted. I'm assuming you actually noticed that I sent you a text to say that we were going to stop the breakout groups.
I will.
Come back to the main room. So an open question in terms of the purpose of a breakout group. I kind of earwigged on a couple of yours, and I heard purposes from getting quiet people to chat, but then that depends on quiet people actually chatting. Basically used as kind of ways of introductions, used as kind of energizing moments to kind of get people kind of keyed up, worked up, prepared perhaps is a more appropriate term. Is there anything else?
I think we also commented on what we all hope to get out of today and how we can use it to give the best experience that we can to the students. Because I think we all noticed as well that sometimes there's a lot of breakdown of the video and the communication is not so easy, and how we can resolve that for the tutorials, that it's not always easy to have smooth communication then if the video is letting us down.
Absolutely, and I think realizing, the connectivity and the kind of, I suppose, the stress of if you like, of not only on the kind of bandwidth, but actually on individuals in terms of how they can chat, how long they can chat, what exactly are they to do. So I think you and I have to be careful how we introduce this, how we use it, and when we use it. I mean, in one respect, we have a group here that's kind of 100 and kind of up and down from 100, and so breaking it out into groups 10 was easy for me to quickly do. However, 10 is a big group to chat. Preferably, you'd be wanting 6 or 8 as your maximum, and I think that's important to recognize so that there isn't too much technical difficulty and there's time to speak. Deirdre, you wanted to say something?
Well, it was just on that, one of our group mentioned that if everyone turns off their microphone, the pictures don't jump around, and it was the change was extraordinary. So that was a very useful thing to have taken from that. Just wanted to mention that in case anyone was having that trouble, because it really drove us crazy in the beginning. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, and there are subtle little things that you can do that can help, absolutely, in terms of that. Silencing microphones and the like is kind of perhaps important in that respect. And I suppose I'd say it's the kind of recognition of what you're going to do. The other thing that I need to talk to you is to say that basically icebreakers, although by the nature of them they're kind of at the start, they're not necessarily all the time at the start, okay? So what I mean by that is that you can use an icebreaker to prepare people for an activity. So there is a purpose for why you go in. It's not necessarily just to kind of congregate, to come together, to actually chat. It's actually about preparing them for a task in advance of what it is that you're going to do. So talking to them about why they're actually considering doing the activity, why they're actually kind of, in this instance, why you're actually thinking about icebreakers themselves. So it's not just kind of an amiable kind of discussion, it's also one about a purposeful discussion. I think that's kind of crucial. And I think in terms of any activity that you and I actually do, you actually want to actually make certain that there is a kind of a cause and a rationale, if you like, that there's a kind of a follow-up, that there's a kind of a logical kind of piece. The other thing in terms of actually, sorry, I'm just muting, beg your pardon, just muting the mic there, there's keying coming across. The other thing that's actually important in respect of setting up your activities and breakout groups is to actually recognize or to ascertain what happens in the group. So in this instance, I was able to kind of hop in and out a couple of groups and earwig on what you were doing. But in terms of actually making certain that your group are on point, are actually following what you want them to do, you've got ways of doing this. Ask them to use the whiteboard to have an agreed and captured discussion, or designate a note taker. Because what you don't want to do is have an activity that basically disappears into the ether. We have a moment to actually have a little kind of plenary and a little chat about it, which is fine. But sometimes our sessions, our breakout groups are going to be very specific tasks. And you and I want to know what was done, how well it was done, and then we can leap on from that and feed it into the next element. And that's really important. Okay, we are going to move on with the slides. And I suppose this one actually is kind of food for thought. Lots of my slides today are food for thought, but I suppose what I mean by this is think to yourselves, how often in large group teaching will you actually drill down to that final point for students to actually have the opportunity to gather feedback, to have a go at something, to question something, to kind of, discuss and analyze, to dig deep. By and large, that happens very rarely in large group sessions. So the important piece here to recognize is that you and I in small group sessions are at the coalface. When we're in our small group session, we're able to engage our students in a much deeper fashion. We are able to get them to work together collaboratively. We are able to get them to scrutinize, to reflect, to have a go at things. And that is really important. So what I mean by that, I suppose, is twofold. One, you guys are really important, first and foremost. But two, our small group sessions ought to be activity focused. They ought to be a place where people can try things. Try things and not fear to get things wrong and not fear to get things kind of muddled, because the whole idea is that there's an environment which people can basically have a go, learn, practice, and develop, okay? And that's really important. So that leads us nicely on to the next piece, the purpose of these small groups. I suppose what this says really is what it is that you will do within your small groups, and more importantly, what it is that your students will end up doing. And I suppose this is actually, if you flip this and pose this as a set of questions to yourself, this is how your small group design might begin to emerge. Does it complement knowledge from the lectures, from the labs, or from wherever? So it has to be complementary. It's not independent. You're not giving mini lectures. You're actually following up on something. You're enabling kind of exploration, critical examination, and so forth. Does it have the ability to expand on conceptual knowledge? Is there time and scope? In a lecture, there's often information overload. There's so much coming at us. But in a small group setting, there is time to cogite, to think, to actually have time with one another to ask, foolish questions, if not kind of insightful questions. The application piece obviously is crucial. Can they have a go at trying things out? The other one that we might kind of not wholly recognize is the notion of reflection. Time and time again, when I work with curriculum and designs, we're often trying to build in space into the curriculum so that it isn't overpacked with content and material, that there is time for learners to actually have the ability to take stock of what it is they're doing, to reflect and be able to kind of recognize where and what it is they have yet to do, perhaps, in that respect. And so that's really important. So if you can do that within the small group sessions as well, and sometimes that's a little task, and I will show you one of those later in the session as we go. It can be really simple. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. The communication piece is really kind of essential, if not fundamental. Once again, a small group setting is perhaps the only place where everyone in a group has an opportunity to voice their opinion, okay? And so you and I need to encourage that. We need to encourage, excuse me, how people correspond with one another. So we need to build that from, from pairs to groups, to brainstorms, to fishbowls, to different methodologies about getting the group to work together and share those ideas and build upon those ideas. And that's really important. Excuse me. The other piece, I suppose this comes in terms of this kind of graduate kind of attribute many of our programs are beginning to incorporate, is the notion of instilling in our learners an ability. So not just hoping that they will do this, but to actually set them up to become not only active learners in terms of how they learn and how they engage, but lifelong learners, giving them the skills not only to reflect on the discipline and the content at hand, but how do they validate their arguments, how do they resource their essays, and so on and so forth. All of those things are really important. How do they disseminate their information? How do they produce reports and papers? And that comes into that final point there, the practical, the social, the personal, and the intellectual. All of those things are built into a tutorial. That's where, or a small group session, that's where all of that can actually happen, time and time again. So you and I need to recognize that we have a wonderful opportunity to engage our learners. And by and large, all of our learners that come to tutorials want to be there, okay? We have to kind of, say that is the kind of truthful situation. They don't come unless they want to or need to be there. And then it's our responsibility to engage them and to kind of keep them there and keep them working to the benefit of themselves. Okay. Moving on to communication specifically. I suppose, the key to any successful teaching and learning is actually, sustained communication. And that needs to be open, it needs to be constantly available in terms of one's availability to discuss. It needs to be immediate in terms of being able to respond to our learners effectively. And it also needs to be appropriate in its response, that we give the kind of, honest, correct, informed answers, if you like. So making certain that there is actually communication with our learners is really important. Again, in online environment, what you and I have to do is not only have our face-to-face settings, our synchronous settings like this, but to support those with asynchronous pieces as well. So whether that's by following up with specific learning activities, whether that's by having breakout groups, whether that's by having discussion threads, all of these things will feed into the synchronous session. So it means that you and I need to think clearly, what is the value of our synchronous sessions? What am I able to give you right here, right now, that I couldn't otherwise give you in a simple video lecture, okay? And that is an important kind of concept to think about. So why come together at all in any of these times? And if you think about it, the key thing here is the ability for you and I to have a dialogue, for questions to be raised, for you collectively, peer-to-peer, to work together and share ideas. So communication is essential throughout in that respect. Okay, moving on. Okay, I'm going to try something a bit crazy here, because considering there is 92 of us, but we're going to do it anyway. I'm momentarily going to share the whiteboard, okay? But what I would like you to do, what I would like you to think about is in terms of your own experiences in related to small group teaching or tutorials, to be specific, whether as a tutor or whether as a learner. What I'd like you to do is think about one thing that made it positive, one thing that you remembered, really good tutorial. What was it? Was it the individual? Was the actual tutor just simply really kind, really nice, really communicative, really open? And also one negative thing, something that just kind of went, oh my goodness, this isn't working, and it's because the tutor has gone off point. The discussion is irrelevant. It was basically a mini lecture, okay? So think about those things. What I'm going to do is share the whiteboard, and what I'd like you to do, and now you have to be patient in this, okay? And what I mean by patient is when you actually text into or type onto the whiteboard, just take a little moment to kind of position your pen, because obviously what we're going to try and do is capture all of our positive in green on the left-hand side of the whiteboard and all negative issues on the right. And then we'll have a look at those and see if we can address some of those. Okay? Any questions at this moment before I pop up the whiteboard? Okay, not at the moment. I'll come back to that question. There is a question, but not specific to what we're doing right now. I'll come back to it in a moment. Okay, so the whiteboard is up. So you have access to the whiteboard. Choose your pen color. Green for excellent. So you can free write if you do, or you can actually use the text tool, and likewise you can actually choose the color. So green for positive, clear instructions, excellent, you're on point. And red for negative, issues arising. So as I say, you need to pause a moment and choose where you put your where you put your text, because you might overwrite one another. So go to some whites initially if you can. Perfect. Okay, so enthusiasm, accessible, Interesting, practical, whoa. Clarity. Approachable, okay. Interact, informative, affirmation. Okay, and then on the flip side, so the flip that I'm seeing, oh, we have a rogue person in blue. Thank you very much. On the flip side, what I'm seeing actually, interestingly, and I say the flip is kind of appropriate term, because many of these are actually contrary to the positive. So there is lack of engagement, there's absence of communication, there's dismissiveness instead of being open. And there is the mini lecture, too large a group actually, which means you might not get to know those in your group. Rudeness, okay. Tutor looking like they're not wanting to be there, absolutely, yes. Not enough content, too many slides, okay. So we have the, yes, the kind of what's the right amount, absolutely, okay. So we'll let that run out, guys. Just finish up if there's anything else coming up. Okay, so passive individuals, yeah. Thank you for moving those, you're very good. Brilliant. Okay. So there's lots, and actually, what I would say, actually, and this is often the case, in one respect, there's a little more kind of positivity, which is nice to know. But by and large, all of the negative issues I see are directly contrary to the positive ones that you have identified. So what that tells me, and hopefully what that tells you, is that there is a very simple way of overcoming these, by and large, okay? So I'm going to come back to the slides. Are you happy moving those around? Who is that? Is that Catherine moving those around for me? You're very good, thank you. I think everything is relatively clear and seen. Excellent. Okay, back to the slides. Slowly, as he says, moving across to the folder. Here we go. I just have to go back to where I was. Oh, sorry, we'll get all the way down there. One moment, just hop, skip, and jump. Okay. Okay, so by and large, most of the issues arising are either, how shall I say this? I'll be kind of direct here, are either down to the individual in terms of the tutor. And by what I mean by that is that perhaps the individual didn't plan, didn't structure, didn't think exactly what was to happen and how it was to happen. So that kind of breaks down into a couple of things. The unclear objectives, what that whole session was about. And if you think about it, if you ask yourself before you go into any session, what am I doing? What am I doing for my learners? What is the purpose of this? How does that work? Then in one way, that immediately elicits the preparation, the activity that comes from it. If these are the objectives that we're going to do, how am I going to make those, realize those? And that's going to, simply kind of, have a knock-on effect in that respect. The lack of preparation is a curious one because obviously that's a two-way process. Sometimes that is down to the tutor, but it's also perhaps down to students, and that students come unprepared for what it is that they're to do in class. And that one's a little bit more difficult to manage, but we'll come to that momentarily in terms of how we might address that one. The facilitator tutor talking too much, mini lectures, this is unfortunately far too common. I suppose it goes back to unclear specifics, but it all goes back to confidence. And if you think about it, many of us might be facing into new endeavors in terms of a tutoring role. And what we do, what we don't want to have to happen is for us to actually give a mini lecture. What we want to be able to do is to act in a facilitative role, to actually engage our learners, to prompt them to do things. And I suppose confidence is really key to this, because what you want to be able to do is stick to your plan in terms of your objectives and your outcomes, and not get sidetracked. And I suppose that the big thing that I always say to people is that, how long do you think a silence is? And by that I mean, if I were to ask a question and I was to wait, how long would you wait before someone answered? Seven seconds. Okay. I don't know whether that was 7 seconds before you answered, Alicia. 10 seconds, yeah. So what you saw there, the moment I paused, that silence was all-encompassing. But what I would say to you is, don't fear the silence, okay? Someone will answer. And I suppose it's kind of setting yourself up for success. If you go into that knowing that, actually, I'll just wait, and someone will answer. And the question could be, sorry, David, could you say that question again, or could you stand on that? And that's quite okay. I'm willing to do that. But what I want to do is establish that rapport. And so I want to be in a situation where you guys can talk, feel free to talk, are encouraged to talk. So having the confidence to just wait and do that is simple but powerful. And that's a really just important kind of point to recognize. And although 10 seconds or 15 seconds seems like a long time, it isn't really, okay? And I'll give you a little kind of curio. There is actually research done on this, because there's research done on everything. And different cohorts, different intercultural groups have different modes and lengths of time in which they will respond. And it ranges from immediate response, or almost immediate, to as much as, and get this, and I'd love to know where this research was actually undertaken, but apparently the longest time in waiting is actually 7 minutes. Okay, so imagine waiting 7 minutes to get that. But this is people, how long they take to think things through. And that's an interesting one if you think about it, because what that is really kind of capturing is the fact that some learners, some individuals need time to think about the question, need time to gather their thoughts. So what is it that you and I can actually do to help them with their thoughts, okay? So in terms of what is the ideal time for waiting, question just popped up. There is no ideal time. The ideal time is what you feel comfortable with. But there is a way of managing that, which is simply to say, when you ask the question, what you say is, write down what you think, okay? So ask a question and say, jot down what you think about that, okay? And the act of writing allows people to think things through in a little bit more detail. The very fact of writing something out means they've composed themselves. They're in better place to actually say, oh, actually that sounds kind of okay. What you can do is, rather than ask it back to the group, you can say, share that with the person beside you. So you're doing a little chat rather than a big chat. So it's not open into a group of 10 or 15 or 5. You're just saying, chat to the person beside you. And that builds up confidence. So you might start that way. And then you could say, actually, now that you've chatted to the person beside you, share it with the other couple, and see what, come to a kind of a consensus. So you build the conversation. And that, that's a nice kind of sound way of doing it. So all of these things are interrelated in terms of planning. Okay, I digress. So common issues and what those are. I suppose the thing for what I would hope that you and I are going to be able to do by the end of this is basically to design out those common issues, okay? To be in such a space that we are prepared and prepped so that those things aren't going to happen to you and I, okay? And to do, I suppose, what I would like to think is you and I can think about what is effective practice. Now, you notice I didn't say good practice or best practice, okay? Because to my mind, there is no such thing as best and good, okay? So hence I'm using the word effective, okay? So you can't say what is better than one another. I might be better at you with X, but you might be better at Y. So I think that's always kind of a strange terminology to use. But effective is very interesting kind of word, because it means what's effective for you in your discipline, in your group, in your cohort, in your graduate level. That's kind of crucial, okay? So the established relationships, we've already talked about that. Comms, that's important. Identifying topics to address. What I'm talking about here is that you have a plan not only for this session, but for the next session as well. And consequently, the plan will involve what activities that you will be doing, what teaching methodologies you have chosen to enable those topics and content to be addressed therein. And perhaps in between sessions, so i.e. there might be connectivity. So at the end of this session, you have some homework to do, which you could bring back to me or share with me online, and that's the connectivity piece. And that's important to have that continuity figured out in advance, planned and designed in advance. Direct assessment of participative work. Okay, so what I mean by that is to actually make certain that the activities you do in session are perhaps formative in nature, okay? And again, what I mean by that is that if they're doing an activity which is, to give the example, to debate the effectiveness of icebreakers, and in so doing, I want you to give me the top 5 reasons why you would use an icebreaker when, all right? You're getting people to figure out what icebreakers are, what's kind of the benefits, and then what are the top 5 benefits. So they have to kind of filter, categorize, and thus kind of distinguish what's better than another, okay? That's a lovely kind of building task. It's quite complex. It's not just a little chat about something. But in so doing, what I am able to do is I am able to assess formatively how well they have done that. So when they present that back to me, I can see the top 5 and say, well, actually, excellent. What we have here across our group of 10 groups are key kind of criteria within each of them that are transferable, and then we have a couple of outliers. Let's look at those outliers. But that notion of assessment as learning is a formative piece, and it means that students and learners are actually getting assessed as they go. So don't think of assessment as the essay that they submit. Think of it as the activities that they do and how you could be informed by those activities, how you and I can be informed, but most importantly, how the students are informed, how they're prepared by ascertaining the values of icebreakers, then to write the essay on icebreakers or to create the poster on icebreakers. So it's a preparatory task, a formative task. And that's what I mean by direct assessment of participative work therein. Okay, so I don't mean, and I say this categorically, I don't mean giving percentage grades for, raising your hand in a conversation. I mean formative activities that enable students to learn how better to do something or to be prepared to do something in that respect. And that's the importance of that. In terms of involving students, so interestingly enough, when you and I do a breakout group online, the easiest option is to hit the random generator and you're all thrown into groups. However, it would be really nice and important at some point, not necessarily all the time, and again, this is choice and determination by you in what's appropriate and when. It would be nice to actually say to the students, now, you have an opportunity to come into groups. This is the kind of activity, this is the task that you're going to do. Can you do that? Or not can you do that, will you do that? So there are kind of key roles. There's a kind of a raconteur, there's a designer, there's an editor, whatever it may be, and you're going to write up a report. And you allow the students to form themselves into groups. This is important because it enables students to take ownership of what it is they're doing and how they're doing it. And that very fact of doing so means that they are much more inclined to be engaged with what it is they're doing. They're working together collectively because they know one another or have come to know one another. And that's really important, and that's empowering in terms of that. So having an activity that allows students to come together by themselves under their own self-determination is really important, okay? At the same time, delegation, okay? So if you think about any small group that you and I have, it is often, there are often many tasks and activities that we might do. Let's say we're kind of doing the poster pages and you're all putting up those criteria. I might say, what I want to do is I want, Catherine, Deirdre, and Jake to grab the kind of the decisions from each group. That kind of delegation is what I mean. And again, that's important because it acts as a plenary piece in terms of disseminating the information across the board. It summarizes what's there. It gets that shared kind of cognitive load from the group up onto a visual or onto a note-taking platform or whatever it may be, or online in this instance. And again, that's really important. But delegating out different roles to different members of your cohort is an important piece of making a group work and work well. And by that, then, that kind of naturally follows into the opportunities for participation in terms of what those might look like, and giving them different kind of ideas in terms of that, and different means. Now, the final point is, I suppose, something that always has to be in every kind of group setting, if not in a small teaching session, if not in large teaching session, which is you and I need to gather feedback about what's going on and how things are going. And the easiest way of doing that is to actually have those activities, because then you can see what the result is. You can see whether or not something was achieved, how well something was achieved, and consequently, you can give feedback to the learner about how to better that, how to adapt that, how to end that going forward to the next activity. But also, and most importantly, it gives you and I feedback about how well that activity actually worked. Next time around, I won't do that. I'll add in this. Next time, I will actually break out the groups. Next time, I will do whatever. You and I having a reflective insight, an action research head when we're teaching is really important. We need to constantly look and review what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how well, so that we can improve and adapt our own practice for the next iteration. And that's really important. Okay, moving on. Now, take a peek at this slide, okay? You have an activity coming up which will last a little longer than our first one, okay? This slide basically is kind of a prep for your activity. And I suppose what I want you to think about is that in creating a session design, there is the practical interpretation about what you'll do and how you'll do it, i.e. the outcomes, the content, and the activities, if you like. But there's also some kind of overarching framework, some kind of ethos, some kind of philosophical stance even, in terms of how you, as an individual, wish to teach, wish to engage with your learners. Now, you can call these learner contracts, you can call them frameworks, you can call them guides, whatever you might like to call them, and they come in a whole host of different varieties. But what I want you to do right now is to think about how your sessions will run. Now, I say specifically your sessions because I'm thinking about you individually, okay? So as a group, you're going to be thrown into a breakout group again. But as a group, you always have to decide on a session, okay? A session. And what I want you to do is to try and pull together only three kind of key elements. So I'll just pop back to that slide. In that slide, the previous slide, you've got the whole kind of personal piece, and respect is kind of key in that instance. You've got the interactivity and focus on communication skills in this one. You've got participative responsibility, turning up on time, doing work. And then you've got the autonomous individual, what it is that they will do in terms of self-evaluation and planning and so forth. I have another example after this slide that I will show you again, but you can hold on that. What I'd like you to do is think about what you would like, what you expect, what you wish to have as fundamentals in your session, okay? So I'll give you a couple of examples. I purposely crossed them over with the practical and the kind of personal, if you like. So there's an objective piece, but there's also participation one. There's communication one, but there's also an assignment protocol in terms of, fulfilling requirements and such and so. All right. So in your groups, what I want you to be able to do is to come up with the beginnings of a tutorial framework, a rule book, a structure, a guide, and whatever you think you might like to call it, okay? But in essence, I mean, in essence, you should all do this individually, but in essence, what this will capture for you is your own particular teaching philosophy, your own ethos about how it is you wish to teach. That's important because knowing that of yourself means that you can work to those strengths, and that's what they are. If your beliefs, if your ethos is to be open, to be engaging, then how do you map that practically? Or rather, how do you assure that you map that practically? Because you might believe in one thing, but the reality ends up being something quite different. So, are you ready? Are there any questions before I bump you into your groups once more? Excellent, no questions. Okay, so I'm going to put you into groups. Yes, what I was going to do, actually, yes, so we're halfway through the session, okay? So what I was going to suggest is that this breakout activity is going to last exactly 7 minutes. I say take 5 minutes, it's going to last 7 minutes. And what I mean by that is you've got 3 minutes to stretch, to run around the room or to whatever it is you like. Then you have 4 minutes or so to actually pull together this activity. Is that fair? So it's basically a flexi task. It's what I do often in my sessions. Okay. So I'm going to put you into smaller groups this time. And this is the catch about doing this, because you've got to try and perfect. Okay, you're going to be in groups of 5. You ready to go? I will circulate the slides again just on the link so that you have them. I'll do that momentarily once you're in your groups. I will see you in 7 minutes at 17 minutes past. Is that what I'm going? Yes, or thereabouts.
really make
back. Sorry if I rudely interrupted your conversations. How did you get on? Good, good, excellent, good ideas. Super. Would anyone like to take the floor and share just a couple of the ideas?
Yeah, we came across, because we were all from different subject areas, our sort of initial approaches to teaching were all completely different. So we really quickly learned that you have to tailor your approach to the learning outcomes of your subject and to the audience you're teaching to.
Excellent, yeah. And actually that, I mean, in essence, that is absolutely it. You know, I can't give you a specific set of criteria. I can give you guidelines and frameworks within which to work, but you're absolutely right. Individually, discipline-specific, cohort needs, level needs, and also yourself. What you have to recognize herein is yourself in terms of what you're comfortable with, what you wish to do, and how you wish to run your tutorial. So even if you're in one of these disciplines that your tutorials are actually structured and you're given like almost like a pro forma, and this is what you're expected to cover, it still doesn't mean that you're beholden to the way you do it. In other way, you can actually be flexible in terms of your approach and your means. You still cover the same content. So it does come down to individual style and needs, and that's really important. So we often think, I suppose, or we often hear about this notion of learning styles and how our learners have a multitude of different ways in which they learn. But you and I as teachers also have teaching styles. Preferences in terms of how we prefer to teach and in what way we'll actually teach. And I think it's equally important to recognize that that is actually an important part of how we go about our design. We can't actually kind of take it out of a book and say, this is exactly what I have to do, because things will change and adapt all the time. So that's really important. At least, open communication, student participation, openness, leaving time for questions, flexibility, active participation. Yeah, so there are almost, in reality, if you think about it, there are possibly some key tenets that are universal to a potential framework, a potential guideline. And it's really a question of tweaking them to suit your specific needs. And I think that's the most important thing to recognize, that I suppose when you are in your group, in your small group setting, you are actually the master of your domain. And so you can actually decide how best to go forward. Keith, did you have something to add? Your group mentioned apologies. Is it apologies for not having something to, or am I misreading that? No. Okay. Okay, listen, we will move on. So that's okay, mistyped. What I really want you to take from this is to recognize that it is important to think about how you want your sessions to unfold, okay? What kind of teacher would you like to be? And yes, obviously there are, prerequisites about what an effective teacher might look like, but they are not written in stone. If anything, you and I have probably recognized is that in dealing with or having dealt with tutorials or having experienced them, there are so many issues and dilemmas that come up that we have to be adaptable to. So although you might have a plan of action, that plan may well be written in sand and have to be kind of scrubbed and adapted as you, as you kind of evolve in session, as it were. And I think that's important to recognize. And that comes with confidence in being able to be flexible in your approach. Okay, I'm going to move on. So the next couple of slides really are, this is another kind of paradigm, if you like, in terms of a model for learning, whether you're kind of going to invoke instructional design, educational theory, or psychology. Basically, there are lots of different ways and paradigms that you might invoke. And I suppose what I would perhaps encourage you to do is to try and find something, some kind of overarching framework that you like. And like is the important word here, not that you've researched or kind of critically examined, something that sings to you, that appeals to you. You say, actually, that sounds kind of reasonable. I think I can work with that. And as I say, there are many of them. So this is just a kind of a one specific to class engagement. The next slide is specific to encouraging and promoting deep learning. Apologies, the slide has gone screwy there. Oops. But in essence, I mean, both of those pieces are at their core is the kind of notion of being engaged with your learners and promoting learning. And to do so, you need, activity to engage the learner in both the discipline and the topic and so on and so forth. And that's really important in doing that. So there are lots of different paradigms. In my Google shared folder, there is actually a whole piece on educational theory that you might like to dip into if you have the nerve to, within which you will find many other models and many examples that might be of help to you. But as I say, you're trying to find something that appeals to you, that works for you, that you can adapt and work with in your own experience. Now, a couple of slides in terms of explaining, and I mentioned I'd come back to this in relation to the assessment piece. So I just have a couple of kind of almost like points of information. I suppose, by and large, the majority of assessment is of two types, which is the formative in nature and summative. So summative is basically what you and I think of as a termination exam, something at the end. And it assesses what has been done rather than what's being done, okay? And that's the interesting difference in terms of summative and formative. So the formative assessment, so you and I in a small group setting, by and large, and I hope when I say this, by and large, are able to invoke different kinds of formative assessment therein. So there are two prime kinds. The first is assessment as learning, and second is for learning. So the as learning one is when individuals are actually doing something. And the easiest kind of example to use in that instance is like in a laboratory setting or in a clinical setting, when I can see my student undertaking a particular experimental activity, or I can see them undertaking a particular clinical examination, and they're learning as they're doing, okay? And consequently, I am assessing as they're doing. So I'm able to say, John, you need to actually, raise the arm. Deirdre, you need to actually kind of prepare those materials in this particular fashion. That's assessment as learning. The students are actually engaged in something and they're getting that immediate feedback about how they're doing. And that's really important. The other version of that is the assessment for learning, which is basically, if you think about it, again, the easiest example to invoke here is a preparatory piece. So that rather than write the essay, you actually say, what I want actually is an abstract. What I want is a literature review. And those are preparatory pieces for doing the essay. And in so doing, the student will become much better informed, much better prepared for the final piece. So that's assessment for learning. So you're giving formative opportunities. All of our activities that you and I will try to do in our small group teaching should be in the realm of the formative, okay? And what that means is that our learners then are able to get feedback that isn't after the event, that it's actually called feed forward, okay? So basically it's feed forward that enables students to react to develop on, to adapt from, to prepare for, okay? So it's not feedback after the event. I haven't actually submitted the essay and said, actually that essay, that was a D and this is why it was a D, or was a 40% or whatever, okay? As opposed to, actually, the abstract was quite interesting and good. You kind of set out the right tone, and the literature review kind of covered most things. But what I would suggest you do is actually go back to the abstract and expand that particular aspect and accommodate that in the literature review. We're going deeper on those particular kind of arguments in that, blah, 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 blah. So you're actually enabling the student to be better informed before they have to do the summative piece, okay? So it's this kind of quasi, the two relationships, the formative assessment invokes without question feed forward, whereas by and large, the summative one is that feedback after the event, okay? So what you and I want to be in a position almost always is in a way that we can give feed forward to our learners, that they're constantly getting that and they're working towards developing and accommodating what it is they're trying to do in respect of the learning outcomes, in respect of the objectives. And that's an important kind of mantra to have in your design. Okay, I mentioned I was going to do this. This is a little reflective pause, okay? So this is space in our session. So although we have although we are covering lots here and everywhere, I purposely put this in. And what I simply want you to do is exactly what I'm asking you to do. Take a breath, take a moment to yourself, quietly think about a piece of feedback that you have received that was good, a piece of feedback that you received that was negative. But most importantly, what was it that made the good feedback, the positive feedback, what made it good? Okay, why was it good? Was it its timely nature? Was it its comprehensiveness? And when you've identified what made it good, think to yourself, how can I do that? How can I replicate that in my own teaching and learning? Okay? So I will stop talking for a moment to let you think. Okay, so silent reflection, which is what that activity is. Really simple, but something that actually gives the students the ability to, capture their thoughts in a given moment, and maybe go in depth or in deeper on something that's kind of bubbling around. Sometimes you and I, we're trying to squeeze so much into a session, so much into a lecture, that we often don't give time for learners to, take stock. And that equally applies to, solving mathematical equations as it does to, contemplating early medieval poetry. Each of us needs time, and each of us may need a different amount of time. So it's interesting and important to recognize the kinds of subtle activities that we can integrate into our practice that may be of great benefit to our learners, okay? And I think there are lots, if you look to the handbook that you have, there are lots of ideas in there about different kinds of modalities that you can use at different times. And I'd like to think you could have a peek at those and say, well, actually, yes, I could try and integrate that. And if you think about it, what you're really after over the kind of duration of your teaching sessions is to have a multitude, a myriad of different opportunities so that individual learners can, sing to their own strengths. They can do that individually, but then there are activities that might come together as tasks, collective, collaborative, different modalities at different times. And that's that nature of choice in the curriculum. It's choice in how we actually teach and how we facilitate. But most importantly, it provides our learners choice in how they integrate, in how they develop their knowledge. And that's an important factor. So what you have to recognize in the teaching and learning dynamic is that, yes, we are here to teach, to facilitate, but we also have to give space in that to learners to learn, okay? So whether that's by activity, whether that's by design, whether that's by different approaches and methodologies. Our plans for teaching sessions are twofold. There's what I will do as a teacher, but there's what the learners will do as a result of that. And that's really important to recognize. Okay, moving on. So there's lots of lovely kind of papers and things, but this one actually is particularly kind of key, I would say, in terms of the feedback piece. I suppose what if you just kind of scan those down through those, what you can see is that the main pieces are, timely, clear, established communications, directive in terms of feedback, giving kind of, valid kind of direction about how best I can actually improve oneself. But the other thing, the very last point that we mustn't overlook in this feedback kind of cycle is what feedback gives to you and I as the teacher, as the facilitator, okay? And that's a multitude of things. It tells us how well things are going. It tells us how students are doing. It tells how a session has gone. It tells us how good an activity might be. It tells us how valid and reliable particular assessment modes are. All of the again, put that little action research hat on and say, how do I know that what I'm doing is actually any good? What are the basis? What are the criteria upon which I can validate my own practice? And so if you pose those 7 steps as questions to yourself in respect of the feedback that you deliver, the most important one is what you then do with that feedback going forward. And that's important to recognize all the time in your practice. Excuse me, you should never kind of, I suppose, end a session and say, great, I'm off for coffee, which is why I have that little coffee pot there to remind me. What you should be able to do when you end a session is to say, actually, before I go for my coffee, what just happened? Is there anything I need to kind of take note of? Is there anything I need to take note of in terms of how well something went? Is there anything I need to take note of in terms of my learners? Were they all okay? Did they all engage? Was there anyone astray? Do I need to follow up with someone? Okay, so that personal connection, and all that takes for you and I is, a couple of minutes after the session to say, well, anything to think about, okay? But if we don't do that, we'll miss an opportunity, a series of opportunities. So sometimes a little moment for reflective pause for ourselves in terms of our practice is, again, fundamental for good nature. Okay, slightly kind of moving on. We're coming to, I suppose, the design phase, the designing the session in particular. And what I have here is Bloom's taxonomy. So this was, you don't need to know when this was developed, back in the, I think the 40s. It was related to food science. There are different kind of cognitive domains, but suffice to say, this is an often used taxonomy in terms of creating learning outcomes. And as you can see from the 7 points, there's a lovely kind of hierarchical scale of what it means to engage cognitively with various kind of parts of knowledge, if you like. So you have from the elementary recall right up to the creative piece, where people can synthesize and create new kind of items. So if you apply those, I'm going to skip to the next slide. If you apply those to two things, really, you can apply those to the design of teaching in terms of specific objectives or outcomes. So let's actually come at this from 2 points. If you come out from a module perspective, you're using these in the module outcome. So at the end of this module, you will be able to assimilate the various kind of components of what it is to make an effective small group teaching session, okay, if this were a module. For a session, you might say, what I want you to do in session is to define core elements of what you think makes an effective session. And then as you move on, you say, well, actually, what I want you then to do is to validate or to quantify or categorize those elements. So you see, these words and this kind of hierarchical scale are very important because 2 reasons. 1, our modules use them in their outcomes, but 2, if we are to use those as the way in which we frame our session, so as I say, define particular elements, what that means to me when I see that, define particular elements of an effective session, what I think makes an effective session, is that elicits an activity, okay? So when I say that the object of this, or one of the objectives of this session, is for you to define the elements, effective elements of a given teaching session, that to me says, how are you going to do that? How is David going to facilitate the cohort in defining that? So then I come up with an activity that enables you to come together, you know, on a whiteboard, on a poster page, in a discussion thread, and to define said items. So the moment I actually take the time to write an objective or an outcome, whichever terminology you wish to use, and I'll come to that momentarily, it should elicit an activity. And that's really important, because that then means I can see that happening in session. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. So in terms of creating that session, here we have a kind of an elementary curriculum alignment for a session. And I'll explain what curriculum alignment in a moment. But when you are writing up a session, what you want to be able to do first and foremost, so these are a series of questions to yourselves. What are the session objectives? What exactly is going to happen in that session? And by and large, the difference between objectives and learning outcomes are simply that learning outcomes are broader. So as I say, at the end of this module, you'll be able to, if this were a module, create an effective session plan. But the session objective might be to deconstruct a session plan and identify key components and different methodologies one would use therein to appraise the educational literature about curriculum design for sessions, and to integrate educational psychology in respect of student engagement. So those might be components that are what we would call objectives, but the overarching outcome is to create a session design. Okay, so that's the difference. There are levels. Outcomes are broader, objectives are specific. So every session is going to have some kind of objectives. So the next question you'll ask yourself is, how will these be addressed in session? Or perhaps, better way of framing this is, how will they be assessed? And obviously by that I mean formally. So in what way can you judge or acknowledge that those objectives are actually being done in session? So sometimes it might be a point of information. So say, well, actually, I'm going to introduce, because a lot of people love that term as an outcome, which always drives me crazy, but I'll come back to that another day. So they say, we'll introduce people to, curriculum design. And that's just, gosh. So, okay, if I introduce you to curriculum design, what do I do? Then that seems to me that that is incumbent on the teacher to provide a lecture on curriculum design. So it's quite kind of, information oriented. All I can do is give you an overview, an introduction to it. There's no proper kind of activity that comes out of that. So you don't want to use something like that, because that's kind of, too expansive. But you could, and thus that means that my role in that instance is, this is what I will do. I will introduce this. And then the next piece could be, well, now we are going to, discuss and debate the various merits of curriculum alignment or instructional design, whatever I've just introduced you to. And that is an objective that actually will elicit an activity that you, the learners, will do, all right? And that's the important kind of concept here. Question to yourself is whether it's online, in session, synchronously or asynchronously. You can figure that out. What you have to kind of realize is, what kind of activity will that be? And again, you and I are in an interesting situation in terms of, if we are online, what does it look like? Do I introduce something in session? Do I have breakout groups for discussion? Do I get people to, use the other tools within Brightspace? Do I get them to use something in Google Docs to actually share? You've got to think that one through and see how you can integrate those elements. And I suppose, again, what's going to work for you and work for your activity, for your session? That's the important thing. And the final thing that you do after considering all of that is, only then do you create the slides, the notes, the readings. Okay? So the important thing is here, you design it backwards. You think, what are the objectives of my session? How will they be assessed? What are the activities? And what then is the content that I need to support all of that? And I deliver it forward. So I deliver it then with the slides first, and then the activities, and then the assessments. And then at the end of said assessment and session, I know that the objectives are met. Okay? And that just so, is actually called constructive alignment. So in a modular programmatic approach, that's what it looks like. And that's really just for your information. You are doing it on the micro for your session, okay? But I put that in there because it's important to know how it sets in the bigger term. Now, what I have here is how we're doing for time. Perfect for time. In my time, that is. What I have here is, it's a bit fuzzy, apologies, but there's an example in the handbook. It's basically a simple example of what a session plan might look like. Not quite sure why that's gone a bit fuzzy on my slide. But it starts with the overall kind of goal, then it has specific objectives. And as you can see, this is the idea of this is it's kind of the very first tutorial plan. So the objectives here are really quite kind of elementary, called by name. So how are you going to do that? People are going to introduce themselves. You have a round kind of table session and say, I'm David, I'm John, Mary, Pieta, and so forth and so on. But the interesting thing to note here is that you have 2 columns, well, 3 columns down the bottom in terms of duration, but you have what the facilitator, the lecturer, the tutor will do, but then you have what the student will do, okay? And I personally think it's really important to recognize that everything that I and you do in a facilitative mode ought to have, and indeed you should have, a direct consequence on the learner, okay? So we are facilitating and initiating something that they will then do and bring it to fruition, okay? So think about your plans in that way. So this is purposely a little bit light on detail. So you can add and adapt it to your own fashion in that respect. Now, I said I'd come to the end and the practicalities. So I'm just going to hop, skip, and jump through these. Are there any questions before I move on in terms of a plan, in terms of anything? Excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to finish on is really, as I pointed out at the beginning, a series of prompts to oneself. But sometimes these are blindingly obvious, but sometimes they are not. So from my experience and from my working with various kind of tutor groups and such, these are common dilemmas that people face. I suppose the key question that you ought to ask yourself before you run through these is actually, do you actually have local support? Does your school, does your college have a tutor group? Is there kind of senior tutors? Is there mentoring? Are you in contact with the module coordinator? How does it all work? That's your first port of call. Do you know what the process is in that respect? Okay, and that's important to kind of hopefully kind of ascertain. And in respect, a little question come across from Connor there. Do lecturers get same kind of detail as this? Yes, indeed they do. But interestingly, the lecturers, as you have done today, opt into that kind of training and that kind of continuous professional development. So, but we do work, teaching and learning by and large works with the entire university, and we have many guidelines and many structures that are out there and available for schools and colleges. So most people are cognizant of these kind of issues and dilemmas. Whether they choose to abide by them or work with them is a wholly other matter for local discussion. Okay, so let's quickly just hop through these, as I say, and just highlight a few things. Check virtual space. So if you are going to use Brightspace, think about how you might use that. Think about the size of your cohort. Do you know who's coming? How are you going to run the session? Will you integrate other tool sets? Will you use the poll tool? Will you actually invite students to upload content either to you as a facilitator in advance that you can share or be able to themselves? Just think that one through. What are your activities going to look like? And more importantly, what are the materials that will arise out of those? And how can you capture them? Okay. From the assessment perspective, I suppose the thing that you have to recognize and hopefully realize in UCD and indeed any higher education is that assessment drives everything. So in reality, yours and my small group sessions are coda for how am I going to help my students address and be better prepared for any assessment arising? So of course, these questions are moot because they should all relate to some bigger element of assessment in the module. So it's important to recognize your role in that and how you can facilitate that. And I suppose the best perspective that you can apply here is from your own experience as a learner, and knowing what the good tutors did and knowing how they did it. How did they help you prepare and be ready for said examinations, said assignments? And once again, in the online environment, there are a lot more assignments that are going to be online. There are going to be fewer, kind of book examinations. And so there are lots of kind of project works and kind of essays and stuff. So preparing people formatively is going to be really crucial in this instance. The learning activities. So I'm very keen on making sure that your sessions are driven by activity, and this is never more important than now, because what you want to be able to see actively is that your students are engaged. So having an activity that does that for them in the ether, in the online environment, then you will know that they are attempting, compiling, working within that. And that's something that we would really miss, or will miss, if we don't have face-to-face sessions, because we can see what goes on face-to-face. So in the online environment, you and I need to have that planned, we need to have it structured, and we need to have it kind of tangible to see that. So activity is key to actually making things work really well. Couple of questions earlier on about the breaks and scheduling, and I suppose this is kind of recognizing lots of people being online at the same time. Is it easier to be online? No, it certainly isn't in terms of teaching. And is it actually possible to actually have full day sessions of teaching or kind of longer sessions back to back? It's really tiring. You need to have plans, you need to be prepared, and you need to factor in that for your learners as well as for yourself. And the fact of the matter is that it's the same as the face-to-face. Our learners could be running from lecture to lecture, or they might be going from screen to screen and not have had time to breathe, to think. So how we address them and how we prepare them. So softly is what I mean in that respect. And then in terms of physical layout, again, that's just what kind of structure will you use? Do you need to have a synchronous session? Could you actually change your tutorial session into a little mini video intro with a asynchronous discussion thread and have it kind of running over 2 weeks? And of course, the answer is yes, you could. If it works to your session design. And you might want to try and do that. You might want to have a long kind of running tutorial session that is supported by discussion threads or activities, or dividing your cohort out into groups and getting to work on a project, and then you just touch base with them to facilitate and to manage that. So there are different modes. Don't think of it purely as a synchronous 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour session. Think of the other opportunities that, online will actually kind of provide for us. Okay, what I would finish up with 1 minute to go or 2 minutes to go is my little maxims. I often use this, and I suppose it's kind of important to recognize what these are. And I suppose it's just a kind of a nice way to finish, because it kind of captures everything set up and gets you thinking all over again. So taking account of individual learners first and foremost. Who are your learners? Where are they? But what do they need? Okay, and by that I simply mean recognizing that they might have specific requirements of your session, of the module. Are you providing enough opportunity, enough choice to enable them to meet those needs? Are you offering them a framework, a structure within your particular design that meets those needs? And in so doing, can you take account of their existing? And interestingly, this is a lovely opportunity as well as a possibility. The opportunity is that individuals have so much more to give than they realize. So by putting them into groups, by breaking them out, by working with them in that way, people are able to leverage skills that they may not recognize they have, whether those are team skills, research skills, communication skills. And that's, again, about yours and my design enabling that to happen. Actively engaged, you know how to do that. That is my, if anything, if my philosophy was anything at all in terms of teaching philosophy, is to make certain that learners are active, both cognitively, physically, in that respect. And that's really important to be able to do that. And as I say, never more so in an online environment. Manageable units. This is a simple kind of mantra, but one that we have to recognize. You don't want to overburden people, and try and keep things simple. So I've opened you with your lovely tutor handbook. Purposely go through that today, because there's only a few bits that I think that you need to kickstart you. So recognizing what's nice to know versus what's need to know is important. Choice. Again, if you can integrate that into your session design, enabling learners to say, well, actually, I won't do the essay, I'll do a poster. But if you double down on that and say, well, actually, I'm an engineer and I'm tutoring engineers, and what they really need in the real world is to write, executive summaries or reports. So let's make this an authentic assignment and give them the opportunity to not do an essay, but to actually make it into something that will happen in the real world. So an authentic choice is often a lovely way of actually introducing that. And the final one, informing students and giving them guidance. So basically that is code for outcomes, objectives, and feedback. How do I know I'm doing what I'm meant to do, and how well am I doing it? Okay, so you all the time say, this is what we're going to do today. This is how well you've done. This is what you may need to do. And that, if that alone we do, then our learners are with us on the journey all the time. They know exactly what to expect. And that's a lovely place to be in at any time. Okay. So there are extra resources, as I say, available to you in my open folder if you dare. There's also an open website. And as I mentioned, I'm developing an Explore module. So there's lots of things kind of available for you in that respect. So don't hesitate to drop me a line if you need to. Are there any specific questions? I know a couple came through that I will try and answer now, but if you have anything, feel free. So it is 1:01. Apologies, I'm a minute over. But I will hang here just for a little bit if there are any specific questions. Otherwise, lovely to have seen, if not heard, some of you. And the video, I'll bounce the video out to you all as well if you need it. Okay. So take care if I don't see you again. All right. Okay, so just a couple of questions up here. So mentoring versus tutoring. So there is actually in UCD, there are a couple of kind of mentoring pieces, and ordinarily those are usually aimed at a higher kind of echelon. So they're not actually at kind of undergrads, they would be at the graduate level. So there would be a mentor in addition to a PI in some schools. And the idea is that you're obviously supporting someone in their journey, whatever journey that is, research, thesis, learning. And that differs from the tutoring role in terms of tutors are acting as that complementary piece to a lecture, which would be akin to the lab session or the clinical session, acting as a complementary piece to the theoretical. So if you like, it's the theoretical and the practical components therein. So that would be the difference between mentoring and tutoring. In terms of materials being available to support tutors, in terms of i.e. a module has been done before and thus the tutorial has been done before. I know that in some schools there are actually specific kind of proformas, worksheets about how tutorial should go. There are even in some instances specific question constructs that you are asked to work through. So every school has a different kind of mode. in terms of how they do things and what they're after. And indeed, perhaps every module coordinator might do that. If you feel that there is validity in asking for previous examples, then do is my answer to that. Simply do, inquire. Why not? What could be the worst that happened? I don't have it, or actually, no, that's a really good idea. We should try and capture that the next time around. Many schools and colleges are still kind of evolving and developing their kind of tutor support. So any questions from you as live and working tutors, I think, is really important to nudge them into so doing. So I think that's really good. So one more comment, question. Some people were planning but not delivering. Okay. So as a demonstrator, asked very little feedback on the letters. Okay. So sometimes people are involved in, I think that's kind of a need for a dialogue with demonstrators, tutors, module coordinators, because many schools, as I say, and colleges have different approaches. So the best thing to do is to open up that conversation and to let them know what your experiences are. Some of you from the science side of the house may actually be aware of, so I mentioned we have a module for tutors and demonstrators, kind of a generic module, but some of the science side of the house actually have specific modules for demonstrators and clinicians that would be akin to actually kind of my module, if you like, but have the specificity of particular disciplines and their needs. And that is actually, those were developed a few years ago to support kind of TAs and demonstrators. They were developed in conjunction with University Teaching and Learning to have those bespoke pieces within the kind of colleges so that their own tutors had those supports. But more importantly, at the time, the rationale was actually to open up that dialogue and to make certain that the faculty knew exactly what was going on and how best to support and develop the tutor demonstrator side of things there. So again, I personally believe in asking a question where a question needs to be asked and seeing what comes back in respect of that. Any other specific questions? I don't think so. Okay, excellent. Hopefully I've answered those questions that are there. Just to reiterate, if there are any additional questions and you're watching this afterwards, please feel free to email me. I will do my best to get back to you in a timely fashion, but I'd be delighted to hear what you're up to and try and support you in any way possible. Once again, thank you for attending the session and being here, and take care.